Don Bluth, the man who almost took on the mouse and actually succeeded. But what many people don't realize is how he brought on the Disney Renaissance. Without him, there would be no Little Mermaid or even Beauty and the Beast. One of the great animators in animation film history, one of the greatest innovators in video games, and a great innovator in university studies with the art of animation, trying to preserve what the nine old men taught him. Born in 1937 on September 13th, Don fell in love with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs after seeing it in theaters and wanted a career at the Walt Disney Company, and truly inspired him to be what he ultimately became, a Walt Disney animator. From an early age, this is what he wanted to do. Mother even taught him music and the lessons of piano. So Don could read music, he could draw, and do all sorts of great things with the art of animation. This was even one of his first jobs at the Walt Disney Company, Sleeping Beauty. John Lonsberry was Don Bluth's mentor when he worked for the Walt Disney Company. John was very tough on Don, but I do believe that he saw tremendous talent in the young boy. One thing, according to legend, Don's first animation and piece of animation was the part in Sleeping Beauty where they're dancing with the owl. I know you, I'm walking with you, I talk with you, once upon a dream. After leaving Disney the first time, he went to Brigham Young University, where he never read one single book and studied literature because he figured he could draw. After this, he got a job working for Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Will the Real Jerry Lewis Please Stand Up, Groovy Ghoulies, and Journey Back to Oz. And then going back to Disney, he got a job working on the 1973 Robin Hood. Was ultimately dissatisfied by as they used recycled animation, but he continued to press on because he believed in it and the process of Walt Disney animation. His next source of jobs for the Disney Company were the Rescuers. Again, dissatisfied by using lazy tactics as he saw fit, especially the eyes, is what he felt. He felt it was very lifeless because the animation he felt was cheap and not the most effective when it comes to telling the actual stories that Disney used to tell and exposing the lies that they did by sitting there saying that we can't do this animation anymore. It's too expensive. But ultimately, Don decided at this point to start his own company secretly and work on his own project. His next project was Pete's Dragon, a movie that he was really dissatisfied with. Did not like the lazy storytelling, the lazy animation, and ultimately this was this movie that made him want to leave the Walt Disney Company. And remember, he was the head animator of the star character Pete's Dragon, and he was dissatisfied. So therefore, he brought on Banjo the Woodpile Cat. The next project was Fox and the Hound. This was his final straw. The lazy storytelling as he felt it. He ultimately did not like this experience. He saw so much better in Disney. And ultimately, this is why he ultimately left the studio on his birthday, September 1979. These 11 men decided to start the rival company to Walt Disney, and they had a secret sauce introducing Banjo the Woodpile Cat. Taking about 4 years to make, Banjo the Woodpile Cat premiered in 1979 as to show people what they can do with animation. People were ultimately very impressed by this. Based around a story when Don was young about a cat growing up on the farm that went missing. And a week later, it showed up. This ultimately led to one of the greatest motion pictures of all time, The Secret of Nim. Your first film when it comes to and when you're making a movement is everything. Walt Disney made it with Snow White, but Don Bluth made it with The Secret of Nim. A movie about motherhood, what it means to be a hero, and ultimately what it means to be a hero. Disney ultimately passed on this project. Don believed in it so much. He took it when he left the animation company and decided to make this as his first feature, released by MGM. And ultimately almost didn't happen because there was a rights issue with the term Frisbee, because in the book, her name is Mrs. Frisbee, not Brisbee. As they were panicking, one animator came to save the day and cut it, and then The Secret of Nim was released. Critics loved it, but ultimately Snow White, Secret of Nim was considered a disappointment. But Don Bluth had to declare bankruptcy after this. But his luck changed with an unlikely source: video games. Around this time, Don Bluth got an opportunity to make a video game using Laserdisc technology. It ultimately became one of the best arcade games and was revolutionary too. But he got another opportunity too. A story about a young little mouse traveling to America to escape Russia and the regime that was going on in Russia at the time. Fievel was almost named Mousy Mousekowitz, but then Steven Spielberg decided to name him Fievel after his grandpa. Ultimately became another great classic in animation. And actually this one went head to head with The Black Cauldron and ultimately won the box office. Don Bluth had arrived, but little did they know that Walt Disney and company, well, they have a little competition on their hand, but they had their secret weapon in Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg and Roy E. Disney. Emotional movie here. Land Before Time is basically Don Bluth's Bambi, where we get to see a little dinosaur journey through life, finding his way, meeting friends along the way, but the emotional trauma of losing his mother affected millions of children. Just like Bambi losing his mother, but we see it in full. The little dinosaur's mother dies. This movie ultimately was made by Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, and Spielberg wanted George to cut some stuff for Don Bluth because they ultimately deemed it too scary. And ultimately, this is probably one of the most children's movie that really scares children. But ultimately, Don believed, just like Walt, that it's okay for a children's movie to be scary as long as it has a happy ending. And this beat Oliver and Company. Disney knew they had to make a move. Taking on the mouse again. This time Don Bluth and Company made All Dogs Go to Heaven. This is probably my favorite out of all the Don Bluth movies. Full of heart, full of emotional impact, and ultimately pretty scary too. But this one was deemed very tragic for everyone involved. The young actress playing Anne Marie, Judith Barcy, was sadly murdered by her father. and was later he killed himself, and he also killed her mother that night too. The scene where Burt Reynolds is saying goodbye to Anne Marie. Burt Reynolds actually choked up, and you can hear him crying. This movie went up against The Little Mermaid. Ultimately, The Little Mermaid became successful, bringing on the Disney Renaissance, but sadly, this is what many people consider Don Bluth's last triumph. And some people even say American Tail was his last triumph, or even Land Before Time. But I ultimately say It's All Dogs Go to Heaven is his masterpiece. Don Bluth then also made Rockadoodle, a movie based on the book Chanticleer. This was basically Don Bluth's take on an Elvis movie. In fact, they had Elvis's original band. Don Bluth later said he couldn't believe it and took it for granted. This ultimately was going to be a combination between live action and animation, basically like what Walt used to do. Ultimately, the director who they hired passed away, and then Don decided to direct the live action segments. This was going up against afterwards Beauty and the Beast. Ultimately failed. A lot of people didn't like it, but now it has a great cult following. Around this time, also, Don Bluth made Dragon's Lair 2, The Return of Dirk. As an evil wizard takes Daphne, he must travel through time. Not as successful as Dragon's Lair. In some ways, very unique concept. This is basically the Link to the Past, before the Link to the Past. Space Ace, another video game released around the same time as the original Dragon's Lair, tells the story of Dexter as he gets turned into a baby, and he must fight against this evil guy. The evil guy is actually voiced by Don. This ultimately wasn't as successful as Dragon's Lair, but ultimately has had a cult following and has the same structure as Space Ace and Dragon's Lair, where they used Laserdisc technology. As we go back in time a little bit, Don Bluth, prior to even Secret of NIMH, did the animation for Xanadu and proved his concept and the love of the art form of animation with this project. Ultimately short, but led to Secret of NIMH and the prior movies we talked about. Don Bluth ultimately decided to do Thumbelina, hiring the same actress as The Little Mermaid and another Hans Christian Andersen story. How could this go wrong? Ultimately, this was not a good for Don. Mediocre. This is basically not the best for Don. This was definitely the beginning of his downfall. A Troll in Central Park. This movie is very lackluster. Don ultimately had a good premise here, but this is the beginning where Don kind of great animation, but understanding music, but maybe not understanding story. And he ultimately even has said that story is everything. And that's where this movie is lacking. It has heart, but no story. The Pebble and the Penguin. Don Bluth's great return to MGM. Although it definitely could have been. Tim Curry as the bad guy, Martin Short, Jim Belushi. How could this go wrong? And to show the story of penguins, animals that mate with one mate for life. Well, ultimately, great heart, great story, but rushed. Then that's its problem. Anastasia. This movie is probably one of Don Bluth's most gorgeous animated films. Don Bluth is back. Oh my gosh. Putting Disney in a run for their money. Don Bluth made one of the most greatest fairy tales of all time based on the Russian princess. Even though we know that she ultimately perished, Don Bluth made a fairy tale here. And this is what made this movie the story. The next film is Titan AE, Don Bluth's first venture into computer animation with a little hand drawn. Ultimately, this is Don Bluth making the same mistakes he made in the past, not learning from Anastasia. But has a great science fiction premise. It just needed better story structure, and that's ultimately its biggest problem. Don Bluth ultimately decided to take a break from directing. He started his own theater company, started his own university to teach young animators how to draw, and wants to get back in directing. Now has made Fables and wants to make a Dragon Slayer movie. But nothing has really prevailed. He even has a new studio, Don Bluth Studios, that he launched in 2020. Don Bluth is a true legend when it comes to everything: animation, video games, movies. If you really think about it, Don Bluth brought on the Disney Renaissance. Without him, there would be no Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, and Aladdin. He made Disney have a competition. He is the one that started it to take Disney because he wasn't happy with the company, left the studio, and made films, and is remembered for it, all because of his dream and respect in the art of animation. So here's to you, Don Bluth, one of the premier animators, my second favorite animator next to the Fleischer brothers. You are Don Bluth.